why do you find yourself engaging with Taylor Lorenz quite as frequently as you end up doing?
Yeah, look, I think if people develop a certain kind of platform
Uh-huh.
where their work attracts a lot of attention, a lot of where a lot of people are extremely supportive or extremely adversarial to the way they're doing their job, there's always a reason for it, right? Like I might say that I have little respect for Taylor Lorenz's journalism, which is the case, but I've got to give her the credit that, she didn't get to the New York Times and the Washington Post because she won the lottery. She did it because she developed a certain kind of style of doing work that was distinct and unique, which is why people talk about her, because she's doing something different.
Do you think it's the style
And
of work, or is it the idea that, not a lot of people were covering the kind of new tech, new social media sectors that she was covering? She was relatively young, probably, for her cohort of
she's not that
reporters.
young, but
No,
that's part of
well, first of all,
understand
Glenn, she's younger than me. No, I think she's about
No,
my. I think
I
you're about
know,
the same
but I'm just saying
age.
it's like there's this whole sense that first of all, no one knows her age, so it's kind of a mystery. It doesn't really matter, except that like one of the things her defenders do that does actually bother me a lot, and
They
this
act like
gets
she's
into
like
why. Yeah,
childlike. Yeah.
they say like why are you bullying this young woman as though she's like 16?
No, I think she's
As though
about
she
36. She's about my age.
or more, depending on how you count. But like so let me just kind of dig into this a little
Sure.
for a minute. First of all, Taylor Lorenz wrote for the number one most influential news outlet in the West by far, without any doubt, which was the New York Times. And she didn't just write for them. She was publishing routinely on the front page of that newspaper. In and of itself, that makes her a very valid, and not just valid, but necessary object of discussion, critique, and analysis, because the influence that she's wielding
For
as a
sure.
result of that position is greater than the vast, vast majority of people in media. And
For
now she's
sure.
at the Washington Post, a slightly less influential paper, but probably the second most influential paper after the Wall Street Journal, third most. So the position that she occupies by its nature renders her work important and influential and worthy of discussion. I think one of the reasons she's become such a lightning rod is actually similar to why that Libs of TikTok account that she felt compelled to unmask has also become such a lightning rod, why it has such an impact. Libs of TikTok, what it does is it curates videos that are published into the public domain by cultural leftists who typically are a little bit further along on the trajectory or the spectrum of conventional left liberal views on culture war issues, like on
Mm-hmm.
gender identity and trans issues and sexual orientation issues. And what it does is it kind of vividly enables you to see what the logical and inevitable manifestation is of this certain set of premises that have become predominant in left liberal cultural politics. I think that's what Taylor Lorenz is, she isn't just a woman working on her own. She's a woman who was hired by and published by and defended by huge media corporations, which obviously, at least to a certain extent, share the values that drive her work. And what she is a particularly vivid expression, just like those videos that Libs of TikTok finds and publishes, of the logical, inevitable expression of what modern day corporate journalism has become. Most of her colleagues at the New York Times and the Washington Post hide it a little bit better. They're kind of more subtle about it. They're, kind of more careful. She always kind of goes to the furthest extreme. She takes it always one step further and therefore becomes a valuable kind of magnifying glass to understand what the trends are within corporate media, what the trends are in left liberal cultural politics are. And that's why I think she's become relevant.
So I completely agree that she's right for criticism. There's no argument that because she's a woman or because she's too young or all of those other kinds of things that she shouldn't be criticized.
Right. We're not in the 1950s anymore. Like, women are strong professionals. Young women can have like really important jobs, and therefore they should be treated the same.
I also do think that there can be a disproportionate focus still because of, whether it's because of sexism, whether it's just because of the person's kind of a do you have a punchable face? Sometimes people attract certain kinds of ire. There can be a disproportionality, I think, sometimes in a kind of a personalization of some of the attacks that happen with respect to Taylor Lorenz, which stopped me in my tracks because there will be moments where I want to be critical or substantively of her journalism, but it almost feels like I don't have space to because, it's, Tucker Carlson putting, cry emojis on her face and talking about that she's like a whiny little brat, And I'm like, I don't want to join that part of the criticism, even if I want to join a part of the criticism with a conversation about, is this something that is reporting that's of journalistic value? Or is the left, are liberals as a whole going to recognize that part of the allure of an account like Libs of TikTok is that it puts a spotlight on a cohort of our community that is polarizing. And it is, to your point, well to the left of where most on the left even are. And there is some cringe content on there. At the same time, can we recognize that maybe there is value in understanding how these images, even if we also find some of it cringe and some of it not necessarily in line with our personal values, is being used to rally folks to support a whole slate of policies that are directly targeting LGBT kids and the like across the country. I mean, can't both of those things be true? And is some of the focus on Taylor Lorenz as an individual distracting from what I think is that more substantive conversation?
So yeah, there's a lot in there that I think is interesting and important. As far as the Libs of TikTok account is concerned, and again, the reason we're talking about it and we are assuming our audience knows about it is already a tribute to what she's done. Just like I find it a little bit oddly demeaning, even though I know it's not your intention at all, of Taylor Lorenz's talent and skill to say she's not that important that she deserves all this attention. I actually kind of think she does. She's oddly pioneering in her own way. And, obviously, I am a polarizing figure. You're a polarizing figure. We get a lot of attention for our work. And I think there's a reason for that. I think our work, your work and my work, in some ways that are similar, but more different, are kind of, different than what most people do. And that's the reason we stand out, right? There's most reporters at the New York Times and the Washington Post, nobody knows their name. Including ones who do way more valuable and important work than Taylor Lorenz. So why do we know Taylor Lorenz's name, but not, Carol Rosenberg, who's been covering, the proceedings at Guantanamo, which, by the way, is still open for the last 20 years, more or less alone, who works at the New York Times? It's because she's a more conventional reporter. Taylor Lorenz does things a little bit differently.
Well, she should start a TikTok account.
Yeah, and then Taylor Lorenz will cover her, and then people will know her work. So I, when it comes to the Libs of TikTok, the reason why, I was actually supportive at first of that account, and very uncomfortable with a lot of the things that it started to do after and has become. But the reason I was supportive of it at first is because there are real debates. Like, you can dismiss them as culture war debates, but it doesn't make them unimportant, about what schools should be doing in terms of what you teach kids, what you talk to children about, at what age you talk to them about, and how you talk to them about it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have cared. Now that I'm a parent, I care a lot more. I think about it a lot. When my kids come back from school and tell me what their teacher said, I'm very interested in it. I'm very attentive to it. I'm very concerned about it. I think it's a normal thing for parents to care about in terms of, like, what is the state through public schools communicating and transmitting to our children, and at what age? And do we want that? Do we not want that? And this account was shining a light on important parts of these debates that were kind of remaining hidden when you had teachers who were saying, hi, my name's Mick Smith, MX Smith. I'm non-binary. I'm a preschool teacher. And I went in today and I told my 3-year-olds that the reason you call me Mix and not Miss or Mister is because most people are neither boy nor girl, and we're going to play a game in which you decide, are you a boy, are you a girl, are you something else? And then we're going to use the pronouns that you want. And my kids were so grateful. And a boy who was a boy stood up and said, I feel like a girl. And I said, okay, well, now you're she. And, whether or not that stuff should be happening in the public schools, I think is a real question, or like absolutely a viable debate. And, it's
Yeah.
like what you said before. We were just talking before where, I think like the question was, when you're a journalist and you put information out into the public domain, it's not actually your responsibility what then gets done with that. The only question is the information you're putting into the public domain newsworthy or not? Does it help inform the public debate or doesn't it? And the mere fact that it then ends up, causing the debate to go into a certain direction that a lot of people find objectionable doesn't mean it should have remained hidden.
But Glenn, Taylor's argument, I mean, and why she keeps asking people to read the article is that it's not, the Libs of TikTok isn't a neutral account. It's not someone just saying, here's reporting on what craziness is going on TikTok.
Who's neutral?
Well, sure, but her point is that there is an articulated agenda here, right?
For sure.
And it's worthwhile for people who are consuming the content to know that this is part of an articulated agenda. So to your point, Glenn, you and I feel like about 120 years old when we were talking about some of this culture war stuff because of how quick the pace of change has been. However, the same people who are sitting around are saying, well, okay, maybe I agree that some of this stuff is beyond what I would want my kid to learn in school. In the same context of that account, there are folks that will say teaching kids that there are parents with households with parents of the same sex is a normal thing. Your kids could go to school and have a teacher tell them, no, family is between a man and a woman and anything else is illegitimate, and come home and say that to you. And there are a lot of people who want that to be the case, and including, I'm sure, plenty of posts on Libs of TikTok that think it's cringe to even be telling kindergartners there's a such thing as same-sex marriages, same-sex families, same-sex parents. But sometimes you have a daddy and a daddy or a mommy and a mommy. And so how do you untether that? I mean, because at the end of the day, it's that kind of a narrative coming out of Libs of TikTok that is being used to fuel stuff like the, don't say gay bill or what have you. And do you feel any ambivalence about defending? I mean, I know you don't because you're a First Amendment warrior and, we've talked about this all the time. But how do you negotiate that? Do you not see there being reporting value on the fact that that's how Libs of TikTok is being used, even if you believe in the right of Libs of TikTok to exist?
For sure, I feel ambivalence. I just said to you a couple minutes ago, and I've said this in every context in which I've appeared talking about this issue over the last week, and there were many, that while I was supportive of that account at the beginning, when it was really confined to just sort of saying, look at this. Look at what's kind of happening in the underbelly of left-wing cultural politics. Look at what its destination is. And then it started to kind of shift into different directions, including instigating a certain kind of mob justice, which always makes me uncomfortable, inciting people to call school districts and demand the firing of people who are publishing these videos, focusing a lot on crimes in the kind of standard manipulative way of like showing a particularly gruesome crime scene and playing on people's emotions, just like the media is doing now in Ukraine, where they show dead bodies to try and manipulate emotions that then lead to policy support. It's always, I've never am happy with that kind of manipulation of even true facts. So I find a lot of what she does discomforting and objectionable. So yeah, my ambivalence is clear. It's so interesting, Bree, that you talked about the issue about what you teach kids about same-sex couples, because none of these debates are new. When I lived in New York in the early 90s, when I was going to law school at NYU, the big controversy was there was this book called Heather Has Two Mommies. And there was like another book, similar one, I think about some kids who have two fathers, and they were teaching it to like second and third graders. And it was just kind of, the argument was, all we're doing is saying like, look, there may be a kid next to you who you have family day or PTA meetings or whatever, you'll notice that they don't have a mommy and a daddy. They have two mommies, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing bad about that. You should still respect the child sitting next to you. And the same arguments took place about, is this perverting children? Is this trying to turn them into homosexuals? Are teachers pedophiles and groomers? So I absolutely think there are serious concerns about this groomer discourse. I actually did a call-in show on it. Half of my show was devoted to my concerns about where this discourse is going. I'm definitely ambivalent about all of that. The issue this week, though, had nothing to do with, do you like Libs of TikTok or not? Do you think the political outcome of her Twitter account is positive or negative? The issue was, should gigantic media organizations owned by the world's richest man or second richest man, depending on how you count, Jeff Bezos, be devoting themselves not to confronting major power centers like the CIA and the Pentagon and Wall Street and Silicon Valley, but turning their direction instead to the citizenry, private citizens who have bad views. And I do think you can, of course, make an abstract, valid journalistic argument that the identity of a person who has a social media account that gains a certain level of influence is newsworthy in the sense that it's justified journalistically to report who this person is. My problem with it is, if that were going to be the principle that we're all going to embrace, that once somebody develops enough influence on social media, not only is it permissible, but actually desirable to deny their right to be anonymous, we should delve into and investigate who they really are, even if it means knocking on the doors of the homes of their relatives to find out, as Taylor Lorenz did. If that were really going to be the principle for every trans person on the internet who's influential, who says, I need my identity to be hidden for my safety, for every Black Lives Matter activist who says, I can't be associated with radical politics because it'll jeopardize my career, so I choose to remain anonymous. If that's the standard that gets applied to everybody, regardless of ideology, I won't agree with that principle, but I can live with it. The problem is, of course, that wouldn't be the standard. If I tomorrow went on Twitter and said that, that trans activist with 135,000 Twitter followers who's become very influential, this is what her name is, this is where she lives, this is what she really does in her real life, I would be accused of attempted murder. The only difference between that case and what the Washington Post did to Taylor Lorenz is that the people saying that like the trans person's politics, but not the libs of TikTok's ideology and politics. And that's what concerns me, is this was a political operation designed to punish a private citizen for having bad politics done under the guise of journalism.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, around the time of Force the Vote, there was a conversation about whether or not we should protest at AOC's house. And the political calculation was that the blowback against doing so, because of how, she is characterized similarly to Taylor Lorenz, I'd say, as being, particularly vulnerable. And I think that she is under a disproportionate amount of threats of violence and all of those things. But the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Protesting there wasn't worth it, because
right, but you could have easily protested at Chuck Schumer's house or Mitch McConnell's house, and no one would have cared. So that's what I'm saying is these standards are not applied consistently, and that's my problem.
Well, Glenn, what do you say to people who say I saw people arguing that she wouldn't have been actually doxxed without you, that some part of the back and forth. That's such
bullshit. Let me tell you what happened.
Okay, all right.
And this is proof of how dishonest these media outlets are at the same time that they demand the internet be censored in the name of disinformation. Taylor Lorenz announced to the world, she wrote emails to a bunch of people, including Ron DeSantis' press secretary, saying, tonight we are publishing an article that will unveil the real life identity of the person who operates the Libs of TikTok account. She asserted they found out with 100% certainty that was the person, that they were going to run the article that night, and therefore they gave everybody who they didn't like 1 hour of time to provide a comment. So they announced to the world this article was running hours before I said anything. In fact, the way that I found out about this article was when Ron DeSantis' press secretary published on her Twitter feed the email she got from Taylor Lorenz announcing it. The person who runs Libs of TikTok DM'd me and said, or maybe I objected to it and then she DM'd me and said, you have no idea what the Washington Post and Taylor Lorenz are actually doing to my life. They went to the homes of my relatives and banged on the door. Please don't say anything, though. I have pictures, though, of Taylor Lorenz at them, and showed me those. So I said, yeah, of course I won't say anything. That's horrible. I'm sorry you're going through that. An hour later, she came back and said, you know what? I'm concerned that she's going to continue to badger people in my life, like siblings and friends. So I actually would like you to publish the fact that Taylor Lorenz is doing this, because maybe it will impede her from doing this to more people in my life. So at her request, I went onto Twitter and said, Taylor Lorenz, who was just on MSNBC sobbing 2 weeks ago about how horrible it is when you're doxxed and the worst people on the internet use that to harass you and your family and friends, went not just to the home of the woman who runs that account, but to her parents' home and her family's home, her relatives' home, and banged on the door demanding information. As I said, hours earlier, Taylor has said publicly to all these people, we know who she is and we're running this article. And then when she wrote the article, she tried to make it seem like it wasn't confirmed until I confirmed it. And it's such, you just look at the timeline and it's a complete and obvious lie, because unless Taylor Lorenz was lying in those emails she sent out saying we're running it tonight, so we only have 1 hour to give you to comment, they already were intending to unveil the name long before I said anything.
I see. Well, let me ask you this, though.
And I said it at the request of that woman who was frightened about what was going to be done to her, the other people in her life.
So is your objection to the inconsistency with which people balk at going to people's homes and personalizing things? Because, you know, I'm reminded of the moment when Max Blumenthal went up to Cori Bush on the Capitol steps and asked her, I think it was about maybe force the vote. And some people, people were like, oh, you're harassing Cori Bush. This is not appropriate. She's out here advocating for ending, the eviction moratorium extending and all of this stuff. Like, how dare you harass her? And, I'm inclined to say that's not harassment. He asked a polite journalistic question and moved on. I'm inclined to say that maybe we should feel comfortable protesting at whatever Congress member's house we need to. I am inclined to say it should be the case that Taylor Lorenz can go and knock on people's doors and ask questions as part of the course of her reporting. And that it's also true that people can be critical of Taylor Lorenz, although maybe there's not the same journalistic interest in knocking on Taylor. I mean, unless they're writing a story about Taylor Lorenz, I don't think you should go and knock on some random journalist's door for no reason, because that's not journalism. Now we're in the realm of just trying to be annoying and harassing. But do you agree that that's the issue, that maybe all of those things should be permissible and your critique is of the inconsistency? Or do you think it was inappropriate for the libs of TikTok person and relatives to be contacted in person for the purposes of reporting?
A little bit of both, but much more the former. So this to me is the meat of the matter. The difference between going up to Cori Bush and asking her a question versus unmasking the woman who chose to remain anonymous behind the libs of TikTok Twitter account is obvious and extreme. Cori Bush chose to run for the United States Congress and she won, and she's now a member of the Congress with all the power that entails. Of course, people have the right to go up in public and ask her questions, even if it's not in the politest of ways, because that's what you do as a journalist or just a citizen. You have the right to confront political leaders, which is what Cori Bush is, but not what the woman behind the libs of TikTok account is. I had this kind of experience myself, like forever, when people say anything about me. I've grown a very thick skin and don't care. You can say anything you want about me. My one weakness and vulnerability is when people say things about my husband. Like the one time I got suspended for Twitter was because someone called my husband a whore like 3 years ago, and I told them I was going to find them and kick their teeth down their throat, and I got suspended from Twitter for 12 hours. I just lost control of myself. But at some point, I had to realize that my husband chose to run for Congress now. He's not a private citizen. He's a member of Congress, and he's absolutely fair game. And I had to learn how to swallow that, because that comes with the territory that he purposely sought out.
So is that not true of the libs of TikTok person, that if you make an account and get a certain degree of notoriety and you have these kind of broader political objectives, that you aren't putting yourself out there as well? I mean,
totally agree. Like I said earlier, like I do think you can create an abstract journalistic justification, but this is what has concerned me the most, Bree, is this is what I really think, this is my biggest critique, is not that there's no world in which I can imagine in which unmasking the operator of this account, this very influential and popular account, is justifiable. There are ways to imagine it being journalistically justifiable. My critique is a broader one, that especially since the emergence of Trump, corporate journalists and the media corporations that employ them have increasingly come to view their enemies not as the real power centers in America. When I grew up, journalism was like about the Pentagon Papers, exposing the lies that the Pentagon told about the Vietnam War, and Watergate, exposing crimes by the Attorney General and the director of the FBI and ultimately the President of the United States himself. That was the journalistic ethos in which I was steeped, that you go and you challenge the most powerful, like the scariest, most powerful agencies. That's the kind of work I've always tried to do. I think increasingly, these media outlets have come to see those power centers not as the ones that they exercise watchdog authority over, but that they work in partnership with. Those are their allies. It was the CIA and the NSA and the DOJ feeding them all of those Russiagate stories for years. So those became their allies, and they became convinced that their real enemies, the real people they need to be focused on, are people who were supporters of Donald Trump or the conservative movement or people on the right. And there's a whole long line of cases where the largest and wealthiest media outlets in the world, CNN, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the New York Times, are focusing their journalistic instruments and weapons not on these big agencies in Washington, but instead on ordinary people and ordinary citizens who have the wrong politics. And that's where I think the perversion comes in. Like I said, if someone wants to mount the case that she got influential enough that it was time to tell the world who she is, I can live with that if it's consistent, and I don't think it is. But the broader point is, I think in general, there should be something a little disturbing and creepy about a major media outlet that has Jeff Bezos' money behind it being used not to unmask the secrets of the Pentagon in Silicon Valley, but a sort of ordinary citizen, even though she's influential on social media, whose politics they dislike. And that's my problem with it.
I hear that, Glenn, but to go back to our earlier conversation about why is it that all of these billionaires are trying to invest in Twitter or post left accounts or whatever it is, I think whether or not you think Taylor Lorenz is doing this, there is journalistic value in investigating why it is, what is going on in these social media spheres, who is supporting that kind of work, and to what broader political ends, because we do live in a world where there can be as much influence, political influence, social influence, with respect to what's happening in these spheres.
So take that argument and apply it to this case. Other than this woman's name and the fact that she lives in Brooklyn and is a real estate agent, what did we learn from Taylor Lorenz's work that informs us about any of those valid public interest questions that you raised?
And I think that's fair. And I think a critique of Taylor Lorenz that says, I wish you were reporting on these aspects of what's going on in these social media contexts is valid. I do sometimes think that the conversation gets off that, I think, legitimate path, because there is something about her as a human being that is triggering to people. I think there is some of that is, this myth making of her own creation, the way she's styled in the media. Some of it is her fault. Some of it isn't. As this vulnerable young woman who, I get that that's part of it. And that's why I want so badly for the two of you to be on the podcast together at the same time. And I won't stop trying to broker that.
I'll do it any time, and will conduct myself with the civility and elegance with which I always do. But, I'd be happy to have a conversation with her. I seriously doubt she would do it. I think one of the things that is bothersome about her in particular, but people are bothered in general, is the way in which power is so often inverted in our culture. Mm. One of the things for which she's best known is being a victim, constantly centering her suffering and her, victimhood.
How much of that is her fault? Because I did see her objecting to how the crying clip in that interview she did was clipped by the people who conducted the interview. So she said, I did a whole interview. I got emotional at 1 second, at one part of it. And that is the crying clip that went around the world.
No, but this is not the only time. It's like she has made like a cottage industry of talking about how she suffers, uniquely as a journalist because she has to get mean tweets and people publish information about her and her family. In the scheme of journalistic suffering, I look at people being killed in war zones as reporters, or Julian Assange in prison, or, Edward Snowden in exile. That's actual persecution. So I think part of it is, she's this woman who comes from great wealth. She was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut. She went to Swiss boarding schools. She now works for the most powerful media platforms in the world. When she has a problem, she gets put on television to constantly say, look over here, I'm the victim that deserves your empathy, when millions and millions of people are suffering far more than
including yourself, Glenn. You don't actually talk about it very much, but being the victim of that home invasion, having suffered the way that you have in Brazil, I can understand.
I was criminally indicted. I was charged with 120 felonies. Yeah. And prosecutors were asking for 384 years in jail for reporting that I did. When we did the Snowden reporting, I couldn't travel for a year because the U.S. government was insisting that the minute I step outside Brazil, we were going to be arrested. So I do think that's part of it. I'll compare my mean tweets and death threats by email with anyone's, including hers. And I do think that's part of it. I do a lot of work. Julian Assange is a friend of mine. I know what he's going through. So there is real journalistic persecution. And for her to constantly center herself that way over something far less, given all the privileges that she has, you said I don't talk about it much. One of the reasons is because I could end all that persecution and all those mean tweets any day I wanted. I'd go back to practicing law. I could withdraw from public life. I choose to have a powerful platform. And I know that with that influence comes those attacks. And if I don't want those attacks, I can renounce the public platform that I've sought out and that I continue to develop. And I think in general, like yesterday, for example, when CNN Plus was shut down, people are very, very affected by what CNN does. A lot of people hate CNN and believe its journalism is toxic, including myself. So they were celebrating the failure of CNN Plus because it's a failure of a certain kind of journalism they believe harmful. They were immediately lectured sanctimoniously by a bunch of journalists. You're not allowed to celebrate this. People have lost their jobs. The same journalists who a year ago were demanding that like nurses and truck drivers be fired by the hundreds of thousands in the middle of a pandemic because they refused to get a vaccine. It's always this kind of thing. Like we're always being told our empathy, our like concern, our emotions have to go to the richest and most powerful people in the society and not to the most marginalized. And I think that's what is so bothersome about her. She's like an avatar of that kind of narcissism.
Do you think, generally speaking, no one should ever complain, no one in media, because we are all choosing to be in media, should ever complain about the negative backlash we get on social media, mean tweets, whatever, in any context?
I wouldn't say we should never complain about it. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that if you decide that you're going to work in journalism and you develop an influential platform, it should be the case that you have to turn on, platforms that you have to use, especially being an independent journalist like Twitter, and see pictures of yourself as a Black woman, dressed up in a McDonald's uniform through a drive-through window in order to mock you. Like it shouldn't be the case. Or like as a sanitation worker or whatever.
Yeah. Or with Diamond and Silk's hair on my head. That was a fun one.
Yeah. It shouldn't be the case that every day I have to hear myself as a gay man being called a groomer and a pedophile by the same people on the left in liberalism who claim that it's so terrible to use those tropes against gay men. It shouldn't be the case that I have to read those. But in the scheme of where we are in the society, like the freedom that we have in our work, our ability to pursue work that gives us a lot of fulfillment and gratification, the fact that we choose it, the fact that we have other options, the fact that we're well compensated financially, the fact that there are a lot of benefits that come from a public profile, makes me understand that constantly demanding that other people pay attention to my psychological struggles that are generated by these sorts of attacks just seems extremely self-centered. Like, I'll talk about it with my husband, I'll talk about it with my friends, I'll talk about it in therapy, but I'm not going to demand that like a world full of all kinds of worse human suffering stop and pay attention to mine. Yeah.
It's hard to argue with that, Glenn. I did want to ask you, you did bring up Julian Assange. We had the news last week that the UK court decided he could be extradited to the United States. He's appealing it. Do you have a word or two to say about anything about how he's feeling, the status of this, what you think is going to happen if he's actually going to be extradited, and kind of what we should understand about the situation?
Yeah, so in February, pretty much every major press freedom and civil liberties group, including the ACLU and the Committee to Protect Journalists, everyone united, which they, even though you wouldn't think that was the case, it's very hard to get them to unite on anything, just to urge the Biden DOJ to drop the prosecution of Julian Assange on the grounds that it is the single gravest threat to press freedom in the United States, in the West. And the Biden DOJ has rejected that. On a personal level, he has been utterly broken psychologically and physically. There have been doctors who have said that he'll probably never go back to normal, that, he's been near death on a few of occasions he's been not just been in prison the last 3 years, but locked in a 1-bedroom embassy for the prior 8 years, hasn't been outside in, over a decade. The one thing I think that people need to understand, though, is the one thing that I think is we're getting closer and closer to the moment where the UK government is going to order him extradited. And I really question whether the Biden administration wants the spectacle, which is what it's going to be, of Julian Assange coming into the on American soil, being put on trial in a Virginia courtroom, likely exposing a bunch of secrets or having to expose secrets in order to prosecute him or give it to his lawyers, and having people being forced to say, this is the first time in all of American history where somebody is being prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917 for doing journalism, for publishing documents in the public interest about the government. I don't think they want that. I think what they've always wanted is just to neutralize him and break him. They want to keep him in prison for as long as they can, quiet and neutralized. I really question whether they will actually go through with it once the time comes, but the moment is approaching, and I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.